You're listening to Uncovering Dark Falls. To be honest, I thought I'd run out of mysteries by now, but dude, it turns out the town was just getting warmed up. In the last episode, I left off with saying something, like, hey, I got this flyer in the mail for some horror-themed amusement park, and I remember saying if I decided to go and if there was anything, worth sharing with you guys, then you would definitely hear about it. Oh my god. Well, I don't want to drag anything out or tease anything, so we are just going to jump right in. Come with me. When the flyer appeared in my mailbox, I felt a sudden and inarguable sense of deja vu run through me. Come to HorrorLand, where nightmares come to life. There was this cartoonish monster on the front, a big old smiling brute with these curled horns and bloodshot eyes, who was raising his thumb and seemed to be pointing at the words with an extended finger. He was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Welcome to Horrorland," and a little button on the left side that said, "Where nightmares come to life." I blinked at it as I stared at those words. Have I heard of this place? It seemed to strike a nerve in me somewhere. Probably a sign that I had seen as a kid while on one road trip or another. No, it was something more than that. I was almost sure that I had been here as a kid, or had seen a commercial for it, or had seen one of these flyers hanging from a telephone pole. The paper was very old, and it had taken on this almost elven quality that ancient paper seems to only achieve after being in direct sunlight for a few months or even a few years. One of the corners broke off in my hand as I tried to straighten it out, and almost as if it had been simply waiting for me to finish reading the thing, it broke into a series of jagged pieces and blew away in the wind. I watched all the pieces go, shaking my head as whatever sort of fell magic controlled the city of Dark Falls and worked in its mysterious way. When Mr. Messer came to deliver my mail that day, I asked him about HorrorLand, and I thought he was going to trip on my stairs as the words came out.
HorrorLand? Now where did you hear about that?
I said I got a flyer for it in the mail today. It looked older than hell, but it seemed like I remembered it somehow. Is that a local attraction? Mr. Messer shook his head and said,
Son, HorrorLand hasn't existed for about 20 years, not in any real capacity.
I said, what do you mean? And then he takes a seat on the porch, and his hands start to shake a little bit as he tried to sort my mail again and again. And I wasn't sure for a moment that he was actually going to tell me anything. But he does, and he says,
Back in the early 90s, there was an announcement that some construction firm was going to start building a theme park out on the edge of the woods, the ones that house Fever Swamp. They wouldn't tell us what it was, and we assumed that it would mean jobs for the area. Dark Falls is a nice enough town, but there's really not a lot of work around here when it comes right down to it. Well, 3 days later, there's suddenly a fully functional theme park on the outskirts of town, and there were no jobs to be had from it. People who went out to the site said it was staffed by whoever they sent from the company, and the sign made it very clear that it was some sort of horror-themed theme park.
So I asked Mr. Messer, I said, did you ever go? And he says,
Oh, sure, lots of people in town did. Heck, Lucy and I went, and she somehow seemed to know the people who ran the park. I heard that some people had some weird experiences out there, ride malfunctions, and weird interactions with the staff, but Lucy and I had about the best time I'd ever had. I remember her dad came and picked us up about sunset, but I only went the one time.
I asked him why that was.
Well, believe it or not, a theme park on the outskirts of Dark Falls isn't exactly going to become a tourist destination. It lasted for about 8 months, and then suddenly it was shut down. They say that some people have been in there since, but who knows if there's any truth to it. People talk about finding an abandoned amusement park with functional rides and strange food and weird staff that seem to have prosthetics that are a little too real. I'm sure that every now and again a tourist or two takes a wrong turn and creates some crazy story about a theme park and what they saw there. But ever since they closed up in the summer of '94, I haven't seen any lights or heard any rides the whole time I've lived here. Some of the local kids like to go out there and draw graffiti or try to break things around the entrance. But I don't think even they're foolish enough to go into that place.
Well, foolish or not, I had already decided that it was a place that I needed to check out. I've been everywhere else in town. I mean, why not take a little vacation and see an honest-to-God theme park? I drove my Jeep to the edge of Fever Swamp, about as close as one could get to the theme park without having to cut the chain and perform a little breaking and entering to get access to the road. I had already decided that if I wanted to see this place, then a hike was going to be in order. So I headed off into the woods in roughly the direction that Mr. Messer had told me that I'd have to go. It was very reminiscent of my trip to Fever Swamp, and I was kind of expecting the hermit to pop up and ask if I'd come back for a visit. The swamp didn't last long, though, and when I got out of the buggy terrain and onto something a little more akin to a forest path, I began to wonder if there really was some sort of theme park out here. By lunchtime, I was out of breath. I was totally cooked. The burdocks were sticking to my legs, and the bugs were finding me very delicious at this point. When I finally came to a clearing, I decided I might stop and have a bite of the sandwiches that I'd put in my coat pocket. It was a nice place. It was ringed in trees and sported a few comfy logs to sit on. There was a fire pit that was already built up for a night's fire, and I could see a small leather bag sitting next to it. I reached out to the bag slowly, curious to see what was inside, but I didn't quite dare. I needed to get back on my way anyway, and I pulled myself up and I started walking again. I had left at first light that morning, but if Mr. Messer was to be believed, then I was in for quite a hike before I got there. In my time here in the town of Dark Falls, I've seen a lot. You know that. I've shared almost everything with you. I've seen bug-ridden swamps, strange magic club, and an auditorium complete with mysterious phantoms. But you know what, dude? The sight of that theme park as it rose out of the woods like this haunted freighter from the depths was a little much even for me. It was massive. It wasn't just some run-of-the-mill carnival that had decided to outstay its welcome either. It was big enough to have its own roller coaster and a massive monster head that was probably some sort of tunnel ride. It was no Disney World. I mean, the mouse clearly would not have taken that sort of competition, but it was big enough that if the tickets had been more than about $30, I would have believed it. I doubted there would be any ticket prices, however. The whole place had a look about it that told me that no one except the old teenager looking for a place to scrawl graffiti, or a homeless guy looking for a place to stay for a while had been here in a very long time. One of the coaster tracks was hanging on by a thread, and I didn't need to see the cart hanging off of it to know that a trip down that thing would probably be the last ride I ever took. I walked up to the front gate, and that's when I saw the sign that had been on the poster. It was the same monster-headed sign that proclaimed HorrorLand was where nightmares came to life. That made me stop again. I remembered that sign, but I just didn't know how. I'd never been here before. It would have been impossible for me to remember this place, but the longer I looked at the sign, the more memories began to come back. I didn't remember it because I had been here. I remembered it because I had seen it on TV. Mom and Dad were always taking these road trips when I was a kid. Sometimes it was to visit relatives, sometimes it was just because they wanted to, but it was usually because they wanted to see some side-of-the-road attraction or get pictures of some oddity from one of the travel brochures they usually wrote for. They, too, were detectives in their own way. Their detective work was usually, centered around paying the bills by visiting these weird little roadside places and then writing about them. It didn't pay a lot, but I can remember every now and then one of them would get this big order from some giant publication and we would live like kings for a little while. It never lasted long. Mom and Dad weren't into that whole stable living life, but it was always nice while it lasted. I would have been about 8 or 9 that summer when we went to the shore. Now, before you ask, I don't remember which shore it was. Mom and Dad had been given a big commission by some travel journal that wanted them to go investigate a strange creature sighting, and we had packed up and went in pretty short order. I didn't really care where we were going, I just wanted to play Pokemon on my Game Boy and get out of the house for a little while. It was right around the time that the games had gotten really big, and I was determined to catch them all before school started again. Mom and Dad had asked if I wanted to come with them when they went to investigate, but I politely declined. I just really didn't get excited about these things anymore the way they did. 2 or 3 years of looking at what were clearly not Sasquatch prints, or investigating locations where the haunting was probably just rusty pipes, and the whole experience had just started to wear thin for me. They told me to suit myself and said they would be back later, and they left me at the hotel by myself. Now, hotel was probably way too big of a word for this place. It was one of those side-of-the-road deals that my dad used to call cheese dog motels, and I was pretty sure that the cockroaches probably had a higher reading level than I did. I had turned on the TV so that there would be some noise in the room other than me, and as I flipped through the channels and finally decided on something that didn't look too bad, I turned my full attention back to my Game Boy as I pursued my eternal quest to be the very best. If you know, you know. When I heard someone say HorrorLand, it caught my interest enough to look up from my Game Boy and see what the heck was on the TV. The show was about a family, the Morris family, if I remember correctly. They were searching for a place called Zoo Gardens Theme Park. There were 2 parents, Lizzie and Luke, the kids, and Luke's friend, Clay. The kids were getting a little anxious in the back seat as the show started, and I remember thinking that, despite it being on TV, it looked like it had been shot with a real camcorder. The dad had left the map at home. Classic setup, for the time, goofy dad. And the whole family was now lost because of that. Pretty soon, they pass a billboard for a place called HorrorLand, which is supposed to be just a mile away from where they are. They decide to drive there instead, but as soon as they get in the parking lot, the car explodes and the family narrowly escapes the blast with their lives. It was a little weird. Cars usually didn't explode in these sitcoms, but it had my attention and had actually dragged me away from my progress through the gyms of the Kanto region. The park looks abandoned, but to their surprise, they're greeted by a costumed toll booth worker, and he apologizes for their car having exploded, and he tells them that their entry into the park is free. The parents decide to let the kids go off on their own while they try to find a car. The kids were ecstatic as they head off into the park before beginning to feel that they were being stalked by something. They kept looking behind them, afraid that someone might be hunting them through the paths of HorrorLand, when they're suddenly set upon by a large, white wolf. It chases them for a while, and the kids' adrenaline starts pumping as they're sprinting around, narrowly avoiding this thing, but even to a kid my age, they had looked truly terrified. When the giant white wolf crashes into a fence, however, they discover that it's just a big robot, and the kids laugh it off as just another part of the spooky park. They start running into some odd signs, one that reads, "No pinching," which makes all of them laugh. It is silly. What kind of a sign like that is up at a horror-themed park? And they even see some stranger attractions, too. I could believe their paranoia. All the shots had this, like this grainy home movie quality to it, and it almost seemed like whoever was filming was following them as they made their way up the sidewalk. The parents appeared to be having an even stranger time. The refreshments at HorrorLand leave a lot to be desired, and when the parents ask about Zoo Gardens, no one seems to have heard of it. And what's more, when they ask about, using the telephone to call somebody for help, they were informed that there are no telephones at HorrorLand. The horrors, the monster people who work in the park, it's what they're called, they also seem very interested in their kids. The adults are more than a little freaked out at this point, and they decide to see if they can go find the kids before somebody else does. Kids hadn't gone far when they find their first ride. If I remember correctly, gosh, and this is just from a hazy memory from, a weird low-quality show that I think I'm remembering correctly, the ride was called the Doom Slides. It consists of 10 numbered slides, one of them being the never-ending Doom Slide that the worker warns them about. Lizzie chooses slide number 3 because, as she says, 3 is her lucky number. Luke chooses slide number 2, probably just to stay next to his sister, and Clay decides that he's going to ride slide number 10. Once Luke and Lizzie reached the bottom, laughing from their exhilarating ride, they discover that Clay is nowhere to be found. They ask one of the workers where Clay is, and the worker responds that he may have chosen the Doom Slide by accident. When the kids asked how they get their friend back, the horror, the guy working there, only shrugged and seemed completely unhelpful. Lizzie decides that they should probably both take slide number 10 together and then see if they can just find Clay themselves. But what they find at the end of slide number 10 makes them think that they might never see Clay again. After sliding through a series of sticky cobwebs, the ride ends with a wall of raging flames that the kids barely escape. Both of them are left with the understanding that the rides at HorrorLand are very different than anywhere else, and your safety probably isn't always assured. That was about as much of the show as I could remember in the moment. Now, here I am, standing at the gates of HorrorLand in real life, but there were no friendly horrors to greet me at the gates. The booth, as I walked past it, I noticed it was empty, and the cobwebs were deep enough that it was hard to tell if anyone had ever been here. There was a sign on the outside of the booth that said it was closed for construction, and there were some more words at the bottom that were inviting me to have a horrific day. The gate looked as if they had been chained once before, but now the chains were undone and the gates were just hung open, and they were pushed aside as if someone had an urgent appointment with the derelict theme park. For an abandoned-looking theme park, it was odd, at least I thought in the moment, that the music was still playing overhead and the rides still seemed to be moving. I couldn't see any workers anywhere, but I could feel that something was watching me as I entered the park. It's hard to describe, but it was just this surreal feeling, seeing this place and imagining the shrieks of nervous kids and the laughter of adults who were seeing something, maybe a little too real. When I saw the sign for a ride that was just around the bend in the sidewalk, I had to laugh. It was a ride that I remembered from the show, and it was one that had given me nightmares. So as I was standing there, inside the actual park, I could feel more memories from the show that I watched that day kind of hitting me again. Lizzie and Luke decide to go look for their parents, who seem to have gone missing. They search the park before getting attacked by a swarm of bats who seem to have more than rides on their mind. As they look, they decide to ride something called the Coffin Cruise. It's a ride that loops all the way around the park in like this lazy river sort of fashion. The kids climb on, thinking it's nothing more than just that, a lazy river. But they're soon proven to be very wrong. I, at this point, was now looking forward to having these nostalgic flashbacks the further I went into the park. Because I was also now standing at the top of the Coffin Cruise, entry point, but there was a sign in front of it that says, closed for maintenance. However, I can still see the coffins as they head down the river and loop back. All of the coffins have their doors closed. They're just a bunch of sealed up, waterlogged, sarcophagi, cruising through the raging river. It was more than a lazy river, by the way. These things were like white water rapids at this point. So I turn to go, and that's when I catch sight of one of the creatures. It's real quick, but I can see that it's green, and it's larger than anyone in a costume that I've ever seen before. And it's got this pair of horns that actually look really sharp and dangerous. It notices me noticing it, and then it starts making this grunting sound, and then it starts charging right at me. So now I'm confused, startled, very scared. I'm nervous. What's happening? So in the moment, I just grit my teeth as one of the coffins comes closer to me. So I run across the dock before jumping into the closest one. It was obvious to me at the time, and hopefully it is to you as well, that I didn't want to be anywhere near this thing. I was already breaking and entering. All these things were very dangerous to be around, and all of a sudden this big weird thing, I'm not going to call it a person because I don't think it was way too big and scary looking. This thing was now knowing that I was there, and I was sprinting full speed right at me. So again, it was obvious to me that whatever maintenance status the coffin cruise was in, I was going for a ride.
Uncovering Dark Falls is written by David Caleb and Dr. Plague. Created, produced, and narrated by Derek Weber.